Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We are on break at lunch for North Carolina versus Wallace Bradsher, former district attorney, now criminal defendant. Fascinating case. But before we do that, I mean, you gotta love that book, right? I mean, Lee Sweell, Rachel Stockman did a great job with that interview. How fascinating, and some of the problems that exist today in law enforcement and working together. I can't wait to read Lisa's book. She's a good friend, excellent writer, and congratulations to her. Listen, we're just going to take a little bit of a sidebar here because you guys may have heard about this serial killer out of Arizona. His name is Dwight Jones, and I find this to be fascinating, too. We have a reporter out there, Michael Kiefer, is going to give us a little breakdown, but this individual shot and killed a number of people, probably, or in all likelihood, maybe Michael will give us some more elucidation about this, as a result of a nasty, nasty divorce with his former wife, who was a medical doctor, and it resulted in a famed psychologist or psychiatrist, Stephen Pitt. You may remember that name. He was on the Joan Benet Ramsey case, a lot of famous cases, shot and killed in front of his office, and a number of other folks as well in retribution years after this. So without further ado, let's get down to Michael Kiefer out there in Phoenix, Arizona, and find out some more details about this horrific case.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So what are we learning there, Michael?
Well, it started on May 31st, Thursday. The Stephen Pitt, who, as you mentioned, was well known to law enforcement and also to journalists, was shot in front of his office. The next day, there were two paralegals that were shot in the office of a family law practice, Valeria Sharp and Laura Anderson. And that same evening, it was discovered that there was another psychologist shot, a man named Marshall Levine. And then on Sunday, there were two people shot up in Fountain Hills, which is north of Phoenix, north of
That's
Scottsdale.
Michael on the screen right now, correct?
So most of what we know about this, on Monday, they identified a man, Dwight Lamont Jones, and they tracked him to the hotel he was staying at, and as police moved in, he shot himself. Most of what we know about Jones comes from the divorce record. So he had married in North Carolina to Connie Phillips Jones in 1988. She went to med school, and they were married for several years. In 1997, they had a son, and they agreed it was a sort of a reversed role, that she was now a radiologist. He aspired to be a tennis pro, but they agreed that he would that he would stay home and take care of their child, and she would work since she had the better income. Now, the first we know that things started to go bad was we have a record in 2007 where there was a domestic violence incident where he pinned her to a couch with his knee and fractured her sternum. And then things boiled over in May of 2009. There had been an incident at the son's exclusive school where the father, Dwight Jones, got into an argument with teachers, and the child was forced to change schools. And then again in May, there was an incident where the father brought the son home from basketball practice, was not happy with his performance, started belittling him, and the mother stepped in at that point, and then it turned into an argument between the two of them. He allegedly hit her in the face with his forearm and pinned her to the wall. Well, she had tape recorders on and recorded it. She called police, and there was a standoff situation for about an hour, and then he eventually walked out with the child and was arrested. She had him involuntarily committed, and he was evaluated, and she filed for divorce immediately. The first thing that happened was that the custody was immediately awarded on an emergency status to the mother. He was allowed 2 hours visitation time, and she was supposed to, this was a well-off family. She was ordered to pay $3,800 in spousal support while they were waiting for the divorce to go through. Well, Then it kind of turned into the usual dirty divorce tricks as to, she filed restraining order or order of protection after order of protection. There were issues over the visitation, whether the child would come or not come. And apparently, when you look at the record of all of those visits, the father did act appropriately and expressed concern for his son. But there was an incident where the son was seemed drugged one night, the father thought. And the child was on medication. He was about 12 years old. And he fell asleep and couldn't be awakened. The father called 911. They took the child to the hospital. Father was not allowed to go to the hospital. And after that, the visitations sort of stopped. And things festered. There were other, sort of upsetting sort of things in this case. The mother hired a private detective who was a former police officer to follow him, followed him to strip joints, followed him in a bunch of places, wrote up a report about it, would accompany the mother apparently to the visitations. She ended up marrying him after her divorce went through. Finally, when there was another disturbing thing where apparently the wife found a map that he had drawn up of places she worked with bodies depicted, something that she described as bodies laid around those places. So the divorce finally went through in 2011. She was ordered to pay him $6,000 a month. They had already split a bank account. He got about $97,000 from that. And then the final sticking point was an IRA account that to which he was entitled to about $105,000. So he was very well provided for. Then we don't really know anything that happened after 2016 when they finally settled up all the money. She had been in arrears for quite a while. That was all settled, and then he sort of disappears. So the next thing that we see retroactively is that he had posted a number of YouTube videos talking about everyone that he was upset with. Apparently, he included various media outlets, and I don't think anyone paid attention to it. In this line of work, you frequently get calls from people telling you that the justice system is corrupt because their divorce went bad. So you don't necessarily notice those things until it's all over. Then the shooting started. The first person who was shot was Stephen Pitt. The mother, Connie Jones, had paid him $25,000, more than $25,000, to do a psych eval of the husband. This was not court ordered, as far as we can tell. It was paid for by her personally. So that's the first person he went after. The two paralegals who were shot were in the office of the wife's divorce attorney, Elizabeth Feldman. The third person, Marshall Levine, as near as we can tell, was just leasing space. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was leasing space from a woman who had been the son's psychotherapist. There had been an issue over the course of this. As I mentioned, the father seemed to be acting appropriately during his visits. When he stopped appearing, the parental coordinator asked to talk to his psychotherapist, the child psychotherapist. The psychotherapist said no. The mother said no. The lawyer said no. The judge says, yes, you have to. So there was some concern, apparently, on Jones's part that the therapist was poisoning the child's mind. And again, Marshall Levine was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We have not yet figured out the connection between the last victims, Mary Simmons and Brian Thomas, this older couple that lived in Fountain Hills. And that pretty much brings us up to where we are now.
Wow, Michael, that was some great and very specific reporting. I've got Andell Brown with us. He's a defense attorney, former public defender, now in private practice. I just have I work a lot in my criminal defense practice with matrimonial attorneys. Actually, it's one of our niches. And when we know, in fact, even as a prosecutor, most of these cases, a lot of the homicides that we got emanated out of the matrimonial divorce context. And one of the terms that you always hear being mentioned, Michael, is parental alienation. This concept where one parent is alienating the child from the other parent. And I guess I'm going to go to one of our people in the chat room, Diana 421 and Smilin' NE, kind of combined have the same question I have. Do you know why now? Why after all these years and after this divorce was settled? I know he had videos he put up on YouTube. Maybe you can discuss that a little bit. And do we have any indication as to why he popped off now to do such a dastardly thing?
Well, no, we don't really know, but we do know, I mean, that there were indications that that he was mentally unbalanced, years before. And this was part of what Stephen Pitt's argument was, that this man is going to continue to deteriorate emotionally and psychologically if he doesn't get treatment. He refused to undergo further psychological evaluation. The mother, by the way, was also ordered to go through anger management, and as far as we know from the court record, she did not go through that either. But there was an indication that he was unstable. He had apparently, again, according to the record, refused to work after the child was old enough to go to school. And that was an issue between them. He never really settled down. He was living in extended stay hotels for for the duration. It's since nearly 9 years, as far as we can tell, and that's where they found him in the end.
Mike, I just want to bring up one thing. You brought up an interesting point before, and I just want to give our viewers an understanding of this. Like, these people are dropping dead. They're being shot. I know it sent a tidal wave of concern in the law community that there's a guy out there killing people associated with legal proceedings. But if I understand this case, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it was, as you mentioned, the wife, the doctor, I believe she's a radiologist.
Yes.
She's the woman that's involved in this divorce. She hired a detective, as you indicated, married that detective.
Yes.
And if I understand correctly, it was this detective who's now married to her that says, wait a minute, I think this is him, and actually contacted law enforcement and solved the case. Is that how that went?
Yes, that's correct. He's the person who apparently dropped the dime and said, we think it's there were a few other leads. There was a name that was circulating of another man in town, and I won't mention any details about that. But the media was hearing a different name, and we were looking into that. I recall that as soon as Pitt was killed, I looked at his website in the practice, and I scrolled down through it and thought, there was speculation. Gee, was this some high-profile criminal case? And it's like, well, no, that's mostly what I cover. That's not what this is. And as I scrolled through and I saw he did custody evaluations, I put my finger there and said, I think that's where it is. And then when the paralegals in that practice were killed, then there was speculation, and I think those attorneys were thinking, who among our clients? Then yes, the telegraph sort of started. Then I was getting calls. I'm sure others were, from lawyers, from judges. What is this? What is this about? Who's he going to next? There were rumors of judges and different people being getting protection because nobody knew exactly who it was. And yes, apparently the second husband put two and two together and said, we think this may be the guy. So.
Right, so just so the viewers understand what they're seeing on TV, there's that picture right there with a guy with the skull cap on that appears to be white. That was the initial description from potentially one of the witnesses. Turns out, obviously, that's how dangerous descriptions can be. And my dad, who's 86 years old and practicing law, always told me if there's a way a person's going to be convicted of a crime they didn't commit, it's going to be on a bad identification. Nevertheless, this is the individual, Dwight Jones, that in fact had committed these murders. And I'm interested, Mike, before we get to Andel, because I'm sure he's got a question or two for you. Was there any indication, again, I go back to these YouTube videos. These videos are of a white mask. They're really creepy. There's like a voice, I guess his voice behind the camera, talking about his grievances with the system and grievances with his wife. It talks about the parental alienation. Do you know whether or not there was a plan by him? And I'm sure law enforcement, I can tell you firsthand, are continuing to investigate this case. But was anyone else on his target list?
Again, we don't know. At present, the relations between law enforcement and the media in Arizona and the Phoenix area in general are pretty tense, and we don't. Information is not that available. We don't know. But yes, the first descriptions were of a white man, and as you say, eyewitness accounts are not always accurate. When things happen so fast, that you wonder if you're really seeing what you saw, and then trying to recollect that. But I do know that there was a suspect that people were circulating his name who looked an awful lot, a white man who looked an awful lot like that photograph. So as to who else was on the list, we have no idea. We assume that the couple up in Fountain Hills is somehow related to someone, and again, maybe they were also in the wrong place at the wrong time, like Marshall Levine, like the two paralegals. One supposes he was going after the attorneys, and instead shot whoever was in the office.
Yeah, what a shame. People really don't realize that lawyers are often the targets of violence because, especially in matrimonial, where there's a lot of anger and hostility, a little less so with criminal, but it's still there. You're dealing with mentally ill, addicted people who are in a very hateful relationship. Andel, as a defense lawyer, as somebody who has obviously handled a lot of cases in your career, I mean, what do you make of like you and me have both represented people with significant deficits, like I've mentioned, but they don't necessarily get to a place to kill. What are your thoughts about this whole behavior and the bizarreness of how long it took them to get to this space?
Well, I mean, it's so tragic that Dr. Pitt actually identified the emotional and mental deterioration that would ultimately lead to this man killing him.
Yeah.
I mean, what an ironic and bizarre situation. And also, one of the things I wonder, Michael, is the fact that it appears that there was a previous history of domestic violence where these firearms legally obtained. Was he legally able to go and get firearms, or was he under some prohibition, and was this an illegal act in and of itself for him to have firearms?
No, he legally had the weapon, and the gun laws here in Arizona are fairly relaxed, let's say. But after that initial domestic violence incident that was reported, he was pleaded down to a misdemeanor. So he wasn't a prohibited possessor. He had only had that misdemeanor conviction, so he was allowed to have weapons. And I don't think all of the weapons used were his. I think, and I don't want to speculate, but I think that some of the weapons were conveniently available to him. I think another thing that's interesting here is that Scottsdale is not a place where you think of this sort of thing happening. It's a very upscale community. So is Fountain Hills. This stuff is not supposed to happen in nice neighborhoods and among wealthy people. But I also think that, and this is something of 20-some years of covering criminal cases, that the media tends to want to characterize everything as a parable of good and evil. The bad guy's bad and the good guy's good, and you can see in this case that clearly here's a man with some serious psychological problems, but there are also factors here where he's basically being denied access to his son, who, according to, again, his visits were appropriate, and he expressed concern for his son. And you have the various games going back and forth with the money withheld and everything. So I think those are the kinds of things that, if you're already psychologically damaged, then this can exacerbate the situation. He's living alone in a hotel. This is just sort of a petri dish for further psychological problems, in my opinion.
Well, I think, Michael, that we're going to be getting a lot more from law enforcement, because they're clearly going to want to see whether or not anybody either assisted him in this, which probably isn't the case, and or whether or not there were other intended victims. But it certainly is a warning to anyone in this profession that danger is lurking around the corner at any time. Mm-hmm. So, Michael Kiefer from the Arizona Republic Reporter, great detailed reporting. We really appreciate you answering our questions. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave you, at least for now, until you dig up some more data. I can't wait to hear what you're going to come up with, because we have on the Law and Crime Network some top crime stories that we need to get our audience to. And on the other end of that, we're going to come back. We've got a lot going on. Michael, thanks again. Andel, we'll see you in a few.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay.